Hey everybody, it's Wes Hagen, Clos Pepe Vineyards and Estate Wines. You can see the beautiful vineyard behind me. It's a gorgeous day. It's supposed to be about 78 degrees today in the Santa Rita Hills, Santa Barbara County, California. And this is basically part 3 of sort of an apocryphal, sort of anecdotal history of wine. The first episode you probably saw was sort of 200 million years ago to the Romans. Second was Romans all the way up to Louis Pasteur, who was the first scientist to understand sort of the kinetics and all of the things that go together with fermentation, as well as malolactic fermentation. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Pasteur to the modern day. So Pasteur sort of was doing his work in the mid to late 1800s, and then sort of in the late 1800s, around 1880s, we had the Phylloxera scourge in France. And I don't think you can talk about the history of wine without talking about two things. Really, one is the setup for what would sort of become the solution to the Phylloxera scourge. Phylloxera is a little bug, and it was basically brought over to England by a couple of English entomologists to study this nasty little root louse that existed in the United States. And then the story is, on a hot August day, they opened a window in London, and these two little bugs flew out the window, and those two little bugs somehow got over the channel, and eventually Phylloxera became a bug that destroyed about 98% of all European vineyards in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There wasn't much to do to stop Phylloxera. There was a lot of sort of people using sort of folklore cures. One of the major cures was, believe it or not, they would bury poisonous toads in the soil at root depth, assuming that the poisonous toads and all the toxins they would release would somehow kill the Phylloxera. No surprise, it didn't work. But what did work was a scientific ideal that was sort of making its rounds in sort of the intellectual circles and the coffee shops of Europe, and that was the idea of evolution, because our friend Charles Darwin had recently published The Origin of Species. And The Origin of Species probably saved European viticulture 10 to 20 years, because the story is that a French viticulturist was watching his neighbors bury toads as he was reading Origin of Species, and he sort of had his aha sort of eureka moment when he realized that if Darwin was right, all they had to do was bring over American rootstock, and if it would work, to graft American rootstock to European vines to keep them from having problems with Phylloxera, because the American vines had adapted genetically millions and millions of years with these little bugs, the Phylloxera louse. So that's exactly what they did. They brought over American rootstock, and believe it or not, about 95% of all European grapevines today, including the greatest vineyards of Burgundy and Bordeaux, Alsace, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, are all grown on American rootstock, mostly from Texas and Missouri. So basically Darwin helped push forward the solution for Phylloxera probably a good couple decades. I like to say how Darwin saved the European grapevine. Darwin actually studied European grapevines for 6 to 7 years, and if you visit his laboratory in England, there's still sort of grapevines growing all the way around it, and that's pretty cool stuff. So after Phylloxera was sort of solved, which really did help a little bit, if we back up a little bit, Italian, German immigrants were responsible for taking the European grapevine and bringing it to the New World. The Spanish actually brought grapevines in the 1600s to Mexico and planted them there to make wines for the Eucharist, to make sacramental wines. But then the problem, Mexico got so good at producing wines that they started cutting down on the imports of Spanish wine into the New World. So actually Mexico outlawed the growing of grapes and the planting of vineyards, I think, between the 17th and 18th century. During that time, grapes were being brought to the New World as well, all over the place. A lot of history down in New Zealand and Australia, and in these areas of these grapes being planted. In the 1680, I think the first grapes were grown in South Africa, and again, those were grapes that were being grown for sacramental wines at first, but also wines to actually feed give wine to the people that had been moving down into that area and the Europeans that needed wine, and it was a lot easier to grow it in the Cape than actually to import wines from Europe. So as a result, Italian immigrants, German immigrants in general, and even other European countries, wherever they took themselves in the New World, they also took grapes. And some of the areas worked out really well. Some of the grapes didn't. If you're talking about specifically American wine culture, the first Vitis vinifera that I know of was planted in the United States by Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, and the grapes did horribly. They rotted, they mildewed, and they could not make good wine. Without the technology probably of today, it's very difficult to make wine probably on the East Coast, but they're doing a much better job in Virginia and other parts of the East Coast for sure now. But really, in Los Angeles, the first vinifera was planted with any success in the New World. And I think in the 1850s, Admiral Hazarthy came down and he planted the LA River Basin in what would become the San Antonio Winery. And then, of course, after his success there, he took his money and went up to Napa, Sonoma. And really, it's interesting to know that Los Angeles as a wine region actually thrived before Napa and Sonoma. But then it kind of begs the question, if that's the whole history of the world of wine, from the ancient world, the vines being separated into different continents, the European grape surviving the last ice age, the grape basically being discovered in the Transcaucasus as a hermaphroditic fruiting unit, and that hermaphrodite vine spreading throughout Europe, throughout the ancient world, down into Egypt and Greece to Rome, Rome to Europe, Europe to the world, then it really begs the question, what is American wine culture? And is there an American wine culture that's actually divorced from this Italian and French accent? And the answer is really no, not yet, because again, we're planting these alien grapes, these grapes that we've stolen from France and Italy, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Nebbiolo, Sauvignon Blanc, all these grapes. They're not American, they're purely European, and we steal them from Europe and we plant them in America in these alien soils, and we pat ourselves on the back and start talking about terroir. Well, I'm here to tell you as a 19-year professional wine grower, I don't believe in terroir in the United States because, again, I think it's a French term and a French ideal that talks about how a grape that's adapted over 1,000 years in a certain area has its influence by the local climate and the cultural practices. And I don't think we have a culture to the point where we can talk about terroir. I think it's disingenuous. It's stealing an idea and legitimizing an American wine culture that's just developing. So I think the best way to develop a wine culture is to do our best to respect French, Italian, and European wine culture, but to start divorcing ourselves, to say, it's funny hearing a guy that owns a vineyard that runs a vineyard called Clos Pepe, an Italian name preceded by a French word. But I do think we need to start looking at ways to legitimizing American culture without really relying on all this, French and Italian stuff, which means maybe we have to stop using clones. Maybe we have to start allowing our grapes to adapt and become what they actually could be in the United States. Using massal selection, which means basically going into the vineyard 5-10 years before you replant. So after the vineyard's 20 years old, start marking vines that are showing like perfect balance, 12 to 15 leaves per cluster, and 3 times the yield weight as the pruning weight. Those ratios will help you really understand perfect balance of almost any grapevine that you can grow. And using those criteria to choose vines to replant in the vineyard instead of taking all these wonderfully adapted vines out of our vineyard every 30 years and pushing the reset button and putting them back to the clones that exist at FPMS up at Davis, Foundation Plant Material Service, to me is a guarantee that we will never escape from this French and Italian accent in an American wine culture. So you'll probably never hear another California winemaker say this, but what we need is our own grapes. We need to get Pinot Noir out of the Santa Rita Hills. We need to get Cabernet Sauvignon out of Napa Valley. And it's a horrific aspect for anyone who has a successful winery that's making a profit to think, well, all of our profits and our ideas are based on the fact that we have Pinot Noir and Cabernet and people know what to expect from those grapes. But really, I think the next step is to allow our grapes to adapt. And if we replant every generation, every 30 years, I think 10 replantings, 300 years, is all we need to get enough genetic mutation that we could start calling the grapes something new. It wouldn't be Pinot Noir, it would be the red grape that's adapted at Clos Pepe. It wouldn't be Chardonnay, it would be the white grape adapted from Chardonnay that exists at Clos Pepe after 300 years of massal selection. So it's not going to happen in my life, but maybe if YouTube's here in 300 years, people look back and say, one guy really understood how to get this kind of American wine culture going, and that's to stop relying on French and Italian clones and to allow our grapes to adapt and mutate, sort of like what's been happening with Petit Syrah and Zinfandel. Are they really ours? No, but give it a couple hundred years and a couple replantings, I think we'll be pretty close. So that's my bully pulpit for the day. I hope you guys are drinking delicious Pinot Noir and the weather wherever you are this spring is as beautiful as it is at Clos Pepe. Come visit us, send me questions if you have them, wes@clospepe.com or Wes Hagen @Wes Hagen at Twitter. Come visit us, ask us some questions, and we'd love to have you at the Clos sometime. Have a great day.